Now, the figure that we've picked to use today is the Reaper Miniature Saproling. Well, Saproling, from what I can gather, is from Magic the Gathering. I'm quite impressed by Reaper. During COVID-19 I actually ordered some figures from them and they arrived 2 days later, and they even threw in a free figure, which apparently they do at random sometimes, which I'm most impressed at. The figure itself is nice and cheap. You can see how cheap it is on the screen if you're here in the UK. At least that was when I took the picture in May 2020, and because it's such a simple figure, it's ideal for beginners. And by simple, it's simple to paint. The detail on the sculpt is actually quite impressive. So you can see here we've got two figures. The one we're going to try and achieve today is the figure on the right, but I will give some tips about the figure on the left in the more winter effect. So let's look at what paints we're going to need to achieve this. We're going to start with the base colours. Now, Caliban green, you can change that for a different green if you like. Mournfang brown, Bugman's glow we will definitely need. Avalon sunset is optional. You may or may not use that, you'll see later on. Same for both of these two, the layer and the dry paints, the moot green and longbeard grey, they are optional as well. Technical storm shield, you will need that or some other form of varnish, and the two shades are incredibly useful for bringing out the level of detail. You might well want to use the Citadel painting handle. There are other handles out there, or even as basic as glue or glue tacking or lightly gluing your figure to an old paint pot, and the glue will only be needed if you're going to put some foliage on. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is to undercoat the figure. Now we do this because it helps bring out the colours. You can either paint it or spray paint it, whichever you want to use. Just get into all the nooks and crannies. Just don't put it on too thickly so it obscures detail, but get it working it into all the different areas. So here's one I prepared earlier in best Blue Peter fashion. So the next step we're going to do is to put on the base colour, and we're using Mournfang brown for this. So before you use it, give the paint a bit of a shake. You should do that with all of the paints you're using, and then get a little bit on the tip of the brush and start painting it on. You need to get it into all the nooks and crannies. As you're painting it, it's better to use 2 thin coats than 1 thick coat. Sometimes what you'll find is the paint's a little bit too thick, particularly with the base coats, and a drop of water will help it flow better. If you use it too thick, it can clog up some of the detail on the figure. Alternatively, if you use too much water, what you can find is it runs, it doesn't paint particularly well, and you need to put another coat on then afterwards. It's finding a balance, which will come with experience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed this one up because this is quite a long part of the video, and I don't think you fancy watching another 5 minutes of me painting that figure. So we're just finishing off the Mournfang brown now. As you're doing it, once you finish, give it a quick check. Check that you've got all of the aspects covered, you've got all the nooks and crannies, and if you need to, just then top it up. So the next step now is to apply a wash to the figure. For this I've used Reichland Flesh Shade. What it will do is painting it all over. It's a very watery paint, so it tends to flow very well, and that will go into all the nooks and crannies. If you are more advanced, you can mix up your own shading paints, but in all fairness, this is quick and it's simple. So make sure you get it into all the nooks and crannies, check it's flowing nicely. If you put too much on, you can take it off using a brush with no paint on it. So the next step now is to apply a dry brush. Now a dry brush is where we put paint on the brush and then take most of it off. So you want a very solid paint with this. The dry brush paints are good, or the base paints, but you take most of the paint off before you start applying it to the figure. And what this will do is, whereas the shade give the depth to the figure, this brings out the highlights. So for this one, what I used was the Bugman's Glow to give a nice warm tone to it, and brush most of it off, and as you can see then just run it over the figure. Now you don't want to use your best brush for this because it will wear your brush out very quickly. And a good tip as you're doing it, if you look at how I'm doing it, is I'm actually running it across the grain, so it picks up the highlighted parts, which are the raised parts, but it leaves the shadows in their darker colour. And it needs to be more than you would in real life with this. We naturally see shade. If you look at anything around you, you'll see there's natural raised bits and lower bits, but when you put them on a figure, you need to exaggerate them slightly so that they stand out and it gives that effect. Otherwise the figure just comes across as too flat looking. So, having finished with Bugman's Glow, what we're now going to do is a highlight to the highlight. You don't have to do this. I like it because it gives that real grain effect on wood. And I'm going to use Longbeard Grey and just very gently give another highlight. And I'm going to just concentrate on the bits that are really raised up. And the end result is you're getting multiple tones for the wood. And you'll see that better once we finish. The light here doesn't particularly help. It makes it look too extreme. Now this next step is optional. It just comes in if you want to paint up the eyes. Now I think that will actually quite enhance the figure. I've used Moot Green, which is a really nice bright green, makes that hint of evil to it. Now if you do miss a bit, you can add it later, or as I've done here, I actually went slightly over and I just wiped off the excess and just checked it was then painted correctly. But you only need to do that if you feel you can paint to that level of detail. So step 6 is to put a base layer on, if that makes sense. Just as we put a base layer onto the figure itself, we now need to think about the base. So you need to use a green for this. You can use different types of green. I've used the Caliban green because I wanted that nice summery effect, so I wanted a nice deep green. And you need to, with this, work it right up to the trunk, getting it, I'm not sure if it's a trunk or what when it's a leg, but get it right up into the gaps there. If you go over it slightly, again you can always just repaint the figure, that little bit of it there. And make sure as you're doing it you're getting all the edges of the base in as well. And you can also see there are a number of rocks on the front. I actually made a mistake and missed one of them and overpainted it, but I remembered after I painted that one that there were another 2 at the front. So go all around those, get right up to them. Doesn't matter if you go over them because we can overpaint that shortly. But we need to get it right the way around, and also I tend to tilt it up slightly, so I'm looking slightly below the figure and I can see the bottom of the base, because then it means I can actually get the edges and you don't have a grey ring around your figure, and it just makes it look that little bit more professional. So, having done the base layer, just like we did with the figure, we're now going to do some detailing. Now, you don't need to do this unless you want to, but I think it does greatly enhance the base. What I'm going to do is I've used a grey just to pick up the rocks at the front, and there's one at the back as well which I overpainted. So I'm just going to repaint that into the grey. Next, what we're going to do is apply the Agrax Earthshade, which is a dark green wash, and I'm just going to put that over the grass to again get that different colour greens in there. It does stand out a lot more if you've used a lighter green. But it does provide that little bit of a shade there. If you get it right up to the trunk, you can even get a little bit of an overlap there, and it then blends in a little. Again, just plenty of Agrax Earthshade on there, and just keep going until you've done that stage. Now, again, all of these stages are optional. Your figure is perfectly usable already, but the base will actually really enhance your figure. So I'm going to use a new technique now. We're going to edge paint. And what I've done is got a lighter grey. If you haven't got all these colours, you can mix them a little. So if you just mix a little bit of white into the grey, you'll get that lighter colour. And what I'm going to do is edge paint. So what I'm doing is painting along the edge of the rocks. Now, this works better when you've got a sharp change, whereas the highlighting we've done using the dry brushing is very good for gradual change. But this will give a real highlighted edge to the rocks. Now, all you do is just put your paint on your brush and follow along the edges. I decided at the back to make this one a slightly different grey, so I put a bit more on. It's a bit more than dry brushing, but it's a bit less than painting normally, so it's with a reasonable amount on the brush, and what that will do is it will just give a slightly different grey effect. So we've got a lighter grey rock at the back. So I said there was a rock at the front I missed, so what I'm going to do now is paint that one brown and use exactly the same technique using the edging colour just to get a nice effect. And for that I used the same two browns that I used on the figure itself. Now when you've got a little thing of that, like 3 rocks there, it can be quite a useful way. If you've got multiple figures that all look the same, what you can do is have one of the rocks a different colour, and straight away think, oh, I'm going to attack the figure with the brown rock, I'm going to attack the figure with the grey rock. So you can vary it to help you when you've got a large number of figures that look very similar. There are ways you can modify the figures, and we'll look at that probably in another video at some point. So what we're going to do now is start providing a bit of detail on the base. Again, you don't need to do this. I like it because it just gives that bit more of a contrast. And what I'm trying to get the effect of is flowers growing around the tree. Now, if you're using it as an evil creature, these could be dying. So a nice yellowy colour gives that hint that the flowers are starting to die. So the level of dry brushing you do on that base is entirely up to you. I find that the end result of that is you get a nice effect on the ground, which just makes that figure stand out. A plain coloured base doesn't do a lot for a figure. Now, before doing this next step, you need to varnish the figure. I mentioned this earlier, I use the Storm Shield. You can spray paint it. I've not bothered to record this one because all you see is me just putting the varnish on. It provides that layer which will protect the figure. If you do something where you want a part to look wet, sometimes I've done it with the eyes. I didn't do it on this one. It didn't feel that it needed it. What you can do is then use a bit of gloss varnish just to make that still look wet. So that's a technique you might find useful in certain figures. So what we're going to do now is apply the foliage, and this is where I've got some clump terrain you can get from any model shop. I've used the Tamiya glue to give a nice light coat. You could use different glues. Most of them will tend to work with this stuff. I quite like the thin paint here because it doesn't form any bubbles, or if you use a bit much by accident, it doesn't leave it running down the figure and standing out. So just brush that on lightly and then push on the clump foliage. It helps give that figure a lovely summery look to it there. So let's see what we've ended up with. You can see there we've got two different versions. We've got the figure on the right is the one that we've just painted, and the figure on the left, which you can see I've painted in less warm browns to make it look a bit more wintry, and I've dry brushed the base with the Longbeard grey, and what that's done is it made it look as if there's a bit of a frost on the ground. So that's more the autumn type of figure. So using the figures in different games. Now, while this is sold as a 28mm figure, there's no reason if you're playing with smaller figures, particularly 15mm, that couldn't be used as an end. Particularly, I think, the one with the foliage on. That gives a really nice result. It could also be used in games like Call of Cthulhu. There was a Games Workshop scenario many years ago in Green and Pleasant Land that actually, I believe it was, that did actually feature creatures very much like this. So you could use it for that. But I think most people will probably end up using it in Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I haven't seen the new supplement that's due out in the next few weeks, which is going to include Magic the Gathering setting, so there may be statistics for the creature as is in there. But I bought this originally, my first version of this, to use as a twig blight, which you can see in the bottom right here in the extract from the monster manual. However, I did spot something. These are small creatures, so this figure is way too big. Now, there's an easy solution to that. I actually created a new creature, the stick blight, which is a twig blight but larger. Now I've actually created the stats, you can see them on here. I've also uploaded them to D&D Beyond. If anybody is on that, or if you create a free account, you can then actually look for it in the homebrew section and see it. I'll put a link into the description below. I hope you enjoy what you've seen here. Let me know what you think and what you'd like to see more of. Thank you very much.